What a year it has been. It began with the president saying he was fit to serve, battling back allegations from Michael Wolff's book. Yes, that happened this year. I had forgotten. What followed was all about cause and effect. Voters headed to the polls and sent record numbers of women and people of color to Congress. Students organized marches and took to the streets to protest gun violence. Historic national disasters ravaged communities on both coasts. And President Trump continued to make his mark both here at home and on the world stage. We saw the country split in two as now Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Dr. Christine Blasey Ford testified on Capitol Hill in one of the seminal moments of the Me Too movement. We also saw families separated at the border as the fight over immigration policy reached a fever pitch. And we saw the death of a president, and with it, a changing of the guard in Republican politics. And of course, we saw very little of this man. But the impact of Robert Mueller's investigation was ever present in every corner of American politics. And with that, I'd like to welcome in my panel for this evening. With me here on set, senior advisor for MoveOn.org, Karine Jean-Pierre, Los Angeles Times White House reporter and MSNBC political analyst Eli Stokols, communications director for the NRCC, Matt Gorman, and MSNBC political reporter Leanne Caldwell. Thank you all for being here to take a look at both the year that was and the year that's to come. Eli, how does President Trump start off 2019? Is he in a position of strength, of weakness? What is he going to have to tackle as with Democrats taking back the House?
Well, he seems to be in a much weaker position than he started the year. You think of Kavanaugh as being the biggest success for him in the past year, but the elections really delivered the verdict in November, and it was an obvious setback for Republicans, a referendum on this president and a very controversial administration, a lot of these policies, and Democrats picked up 40 seats in the House, as you know, and the president, as a result of that, is going to have to deal with a whole lot of investigations, not just into the Russia matters that we've heard about for 2 years, but into personal financial issues in terms of decisions that he made or didn't make, relaxing of sanctions, the Khashoggi stuff. I mean, Democrats have already indicated that they plan to subpoena a whole lot of White House documents. That's going to be uncomfortable. Obviously, the Mueller investigation, that seems to be reaching an end game. There's darkening clouds hovering over this White House as a result of that. And there's been an exodus of the people who have been hanging on in this administration, trying to rein in this president, to direct him in a more positive, focused direction. A lot of those people are leaving. I talked to somebody within the last week or two who said, a high-ranking administration official said, I don't know who's going to be here at the end of January. We saw in recent weeks they had two top choices for chief of staff, turn them down. People don't generally turn down that job when it's offered, and it just tells you about what people close to the president, what Republicans generally are anticipating heading into next year. They're not anticipating it being a whole lot of fun.
In a relatively bad spot. Matt Gorman, you were heavily involved in the Republican effort to try to hang on to the House, and obviously you had a very difficult year.
Yeah.
What lessons did you take away from what happened, and what would you say the Republican Party needs to do to regroup in the new year?
Well, I think we got to focus on the suburbs. That's where we lost a lot of seats. I think in the closing weeks, the focus on immigration certainly affected us in a negative way in a lot of seats.
So you think that the president going out there and talking about immigration, talking about the caravan, that was a net negative?
According to several polls in a lot of competitive seats, we saw yes. I think certainly you have Congressman Curbelo on. We had polls that showed him doing pretty well, but as the focus on immigration started to take over the national dialogue, those poll numbers slipped. You could say that for places in California, places in the Texas suburbs as well, with Pete Sessions, John Colbert, and others. Will Hurd barely hung on. That was a place where both sides, Democrats and Republicans, pulled out of thinking it was a lost cause. He was in a cruise to re-election. So I think that focus really affected races breaking late. When it comes to the suburbs, I think, again, it was a referendum on Trump, as you said, Eli, but 2020 is going to be a choice, just like it was in 2016. So however the Democratic nominee is going to be defined, for better or worse, is going to tell us also a lot of where Congress goes.
Yeah. Leanne, one trend that we saw in 2018, and I'm interested to see how it's going to play out in the course of this presidential race that Matt mentions, women, right, overwhelmingly winning on the Democratic side, but just getting decimated on the Republican side. I mean, 13 Republican women in the House of Representatives coming up in 2019. It's just stunning. And several of them are looking at their largely white male leaders and saying, guys, hello, this is a huge problem. What are we going to do? But sometimes it seems like Republican leaders have their heads in the sand about it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. They do. They're pushing back against these 13 Republican women who are trying to have a bigger voice, who are trying to recruit more women into the party. And some of them are saying there's not really a problem. And I think that, getting to Matt's point, they have to recognize that there's a problem if there's going to do anything about it.
Karine, let's pick up on what Leanne was talking about with this record number of women winning, especially as we head into what is inevitably going to be a 2020 primary season. And there are already some Democrats who are kind of looking at these early polling and wondering, hey, why are there white men at the top of our polls? Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Beto O'Rourke has gotten a lot of excitement. What do you think the Democratic Party needs to do to make sure that they're keeping excitement among people that they're going to need?
I think it's still very early. I think the people that you just named are folks who have name ID. I mean, Beto O'Rourke just came off of a very national race and became like one of the stars of the Democratic Party. So it's not surprising that his name is trending out there. Biden, clearly a popular former vice president, and Bernie Sanders, who almost became the nominee and very competitive in 2016. So I think it will come. I think it is important. One of the things that I am excited about this 2020 Democratic presidential primary is that it's going to be big, yes, but it's going to be diverse. You're going to have the Kamala Harris, the Elizabeth Warren, and so forth in that primary. And once it gets started, and once people start hearing from them, I think those numbers will shift and move around a bit.
Yeah. So, Eli, who do you think President Trump wants to run against in 2020? If he could pick his Democratic opponent, and in the realm of the serious?
I think Elizabeth Warren, we've already seen him sort of relish attacking her as Pocahontas. He's taken a little bit of paint off of her, given that she had to respond earlier in this year to those attacks very directly. A lot of people think that didn't do her
damaging.
Any favors as well, the response. So I think she's up there on the list. The president, though, as we all know, he needs to have a foil. He did better when, as Matt said, it's a binary choice, Trump or Clinton. He did better when it was, do you want Hillary or do you want me? It was one or the other. I think he enjoys having the foil of the media right now. That's really all he has. With Democrats taking over the House and Congress, he will be able to run against them and say, you're in charge too now. And if he's smart politically, I think he'll start to do that. And I think he'll also, as we know, just sort of be consuming the Democratic primary like the rest of the country is on television.
And we will hear changing the channel,
yeah, we will
reading
hear
the
his thoughts, and you'll be able to tell from what he tweets who he'd like to run against, who, by the nicknames and sort of who he's having the most fun attacking. I think he's probably the most nervous about someone like Biden, or perhaps, if this gets further along, someone maybe in the Biden mold, a Sherrod Brown, somebody who really would challenge him in those states that were key to his Electoral College victory, where Republicans did very poorly in November.
Matt, do you think the Republican Party would benefit from a primary challenge to Donald Trump, or would it be incredibly damaging?
I don't think that's ever really benefited a party if having a sitting president be primaried. I think you've already seen the RNC and other folks come together and say this is not the best interest of the party. South Carolina is talking about canceling their primary. I think for the most part, with the president, you have him for 8 years in the ballot. And again, I think the primary would just divide the party in a very unnecessary way. And especially for folks down ballot, that would be just a terrible, terrible thing to have a distraction.
So who is going to campaign with the president in 2020?
That's a great question. I think it would depend on what your race is, right? So we had him travel to, Duluth, Minnesota, down to the Rochester area of Minnesota, across the Midwest. But let's also not forget, he's going to come to these states whether they like it or not. He's going to be in Ohio. He's going to be in Florida. He's going to be in Maine as well. These are going to be battleground states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and others. So it's not a matter of wanting to campaign. He's going to be there.
Yeah. Karine, before we go, I want to also back up to something that we mentioned at the top, and that is Brett Kavanaugh and how divisive that fight was. What kind of moment was that for the Me Too movement? I mean, there were a lot of people who considered what happened to be something of a failure, because ultimately he did land on the bench. And, are those scars going to heal?
It was absolutely a devastating blow to many women just across the country. I was one of those folks who spoke almost every day in front of the SCOTUS building and during those protests. And it was hard. It was tough for the women that I met out there, but it also energized. I mean, we were, the Democratic base had been energized since the 2016 election, certainly since the Women's March. So the energy had been there, but there was something that really ignited the base even more after that. I think folks, while they were torn and they were hurt by it, they realized that the fight needed to continue and that they needed to show up.
It energized the Republican base, though, as well.
But I think it energized them before the actual vote, right? I think before the vote, folks in that base were like, okay, we got to get Kavanaugh. That's our guy. We got to fight for him. And then once he was on, it lasted for a little bit, but I think because of the loss, it energized more, I would argue, the Democratic base, because now you have a loss. Now you have something to really fight against. Now you have something to talk about and to really say, hey, we got to take back the House. We have to do better in these states. We have to make sure people get elected, diverse people get elected, and Democrats get elected.
Leanne, you covered the Kavanaugh hearings extensively. What's your takeaway on what that moment meant to the country?
Yeah, that's a good question, Casey. So I think that it gets back into what we were just discussing about women and the enormous amount of women that's going to serve in Congress and how the Republican Party is suffering with women. I think it's very symbolic of where this country is. This country is quite divided. I think that the Kavanaugh hearings continue to divide the country, but I also think it was a really seminal moment in the sense that you had this woman come before the committee, tell her story, yes, and the Republican men tried to not bash her. That didn't last completely 100%, but there was more of an awareness then, and the Anita Hill hearings, 30 years ago, then there's more awareness now than there was back then. And I think that that's a little bit of a progress.
Yeah, they certainly were very aware of the tone that they needed to make sure that they avoided. Leanne Caldwell, Karine Jean-Pierre, Eli Stokols, Matt Gorman, thank you all.